Everyone, welcome to BowTieSecurityGuy After Dark. My guest today is Derek Alexander. He is the manager of data governance at McKesson, which I now got right. Derek, welcome. Tell me a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into technology.
Okay, so I guess I took kind of a weird path. So went to high school, uh, went to a tech school, New Jersey Institute of Technology, kind of begrudgingly. I'd gotten in at better schools and just didn't really feel the pull of college at that point in time. Went, I got put in classes that were well beneath where I should have been, and kind of just messed around. I didn't really show up to classes. I went in for a couple of sessions and saw the workload was kind of beneath where I thought my aptitude was, and just kind of stopped going. I was selling computers at that point in time, and figured, well, I'm making okay money. I don't really care about this college thing. Went about a semester and had a 0 GPA, largely because I didn't show up to any classes. And they said, hey, maybe you don't come next semester and try to figure things out. I said, okay, well, I'm living at home with my parents. I got no bills. I'm making lots of money selling computers to a now defunct Gateway Computers. And I said, well, I'm fine with this then. So I did that for a few years and started to, hate the idea of sales. I'm not a terribly outgoing person, but for some reason I could kind of turn it on when I had to. I said, well, I can't imagine myself being 40, 50 years old and not knowing how much income I'm going to make on any particular month. Someone that I worked with at the time used to live in Florida. He said, hey, there's a school for computer animation, down there that's really cool. And I looked it up and said, I could do that. Now, the obvious question is, so you were really big into art at that point in time? No, no, not at all. I figured, a person who can't draw a circle should definitely go to school for computer animation. That's right up my alley. So packed it up, moved on down to Orlando, Florida, and did relatively well. For some strange reason, I picked up computer animation pretty well. Graduated down there. Took a little while to find a job. My skill set was unfortunately kind of limited. There's kind of a wide kind of birth of things you can do in computer animation, and modeling and lighting and character rigging and animation and fluid dynamics and all this stuff. And I was really good at modeling, but not anything. If you said, hey, model organic life forms, not really my thing. I could model kind of vehicles and robots and kind of hard surface things. Finally got a job at a university in Southern Virginia that was doing kind of animations for presentations of things that NASA would be putting up in space. So this was early 2000s, and things like the James Webb and Jupiter Icy Moon Lander and things like that. So I was making these really cool 3D models and animations that we had like these giant like 10-foot displays and stereoscopic glasses, and things are pretty fun. Wasn't making a lot of money, but kind of enjoyed life down there. Funding started to dry up, got laid off. Buddy of mine at the time was a patent examiner at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And we were really close, and he knew that I did sales management in the past. And he said, hey, they're hiring program analysts here all the time. Let's punch up your resume, make it look, really managery, from your sales management experience. I'll get you an interview. If you can interview well, maybe you'll get in here. So I said, okay, why not? Nothing's really tying me down here. So let me go ahead and try this out. Got a job as a program analyst in one of the centers at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and moved on up to the D.C. area. Kind of worked my way up there, took on more and more responsibility in special projects. Ended up in the CIO's office as kind of like a junior PM, maybe somewhere between a project coordinator and a junior PM. My first kind of foray really understanding technology and kind of project management. So they were doing kind of a massive overhaul of the entire patent examination system. So I started getting kind of plugged in with waterfall and agile. What goes into writing requirements documents, how do you engage vendors effectively, things like that. I got tasked with kind of interfacing with some of the vendors who would be doing kind of UI design. Something that's kind of come up in my career quite a few times because of some of my background in 3D animation, kind of digital art, has been, well, you understand the art side of the house, so we can trust you with UI work and graphics work. So I said, okay, fine. So
So
spent a little
were
while
you
there.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
when you were doing like when you started getting more into the technical side, how did those skills translate? Of course, like the graphics stuff, but was there anything else that you kind of were able to hold on to or that was of value to you in the new kind of path that you were on?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I've always been kind of involved in computers and such. My first computer was when I was about 9 years old. It was a IBM 386 PS1, 16 megahertz machine. And like any curious technology kind of kid, I got like Flight Simulator, and I bought a flight yoke, and hey, there's nowhere to plug this in. Well, I can go buy an ISA card, and or ISI was it ISA? Yeah, ISA.
Yeah.
I can go buy an ISA card, and I break this thing apart, and I'll find a slot for it, and I'll figure out how to put it in, and I'll figure out how to load drivers, and wow, now I've got a new peripheral. And all right, well, I want to play around with some internet. And, let me put a new modem in this thing, and get yelled at by my parents while I was tying up the only phone line. So kind of getting up and running with computers and technology was something important to me. By the time I was working and selling computers, which was kind of the late '90s, that was at the time where, well, I can buy a computer, I could make a computer. So it's like, all right,
Yeah.
let me figure out how parts go together. Let me figure out how to build computers. Let me start to troubleshoot things. While I was selling computers, I started selling, a lot more. Instead of to retail customers, a few businesses came in and they asked questions about, what do we do about it, server setup, and, oh, let me figure it out for you. Let me see what you guys need from a network standpoint. Let me figure out what you guys are running, what kind of server you might need. And all right, well, let me just start researching on this a little bit more. I started doing that, started selling to a lot more business customers who started, kind of putting more business customers my way. And then the questions, started to come up of, all right, well, you just sold us all this equipment. Who's going to set up our network? And, kind of fearful in the beginning was, well, I don't know, go find somebody. And, more and more of those questions hit me. I said, well, why can't I do that? I can figure this stuff. I can figure out how to, configure, a small business server. I can configure a network for people. I can, set up firewalls and, switches and routers. And so, slowly but surely, I would start to say, well, I can do that for you. And, you make a few, problems in the beginning that you fix on your own, but I got to a place where, I could design and, implement a network and, configure things and get people set up. So that kind of carried through. I just feel like, technology that I've kind of had my hands around came kind of easily to me. So
Yeah.
that's just something that, left to my own devices, I don't really venture out and pick up things, but when I have to for a reason, well, then
Right.
kind of get myself into it, and I do a pretty decent job of getting at least functional, So that
Well,
kind of,
I mean, now they've got, I always try to explain to people when we were figuring this stuff out, and we're not that old, right? We're in our early 40s. Um, that we couldn't look it up online. Like
no,
there wasn't anything like YouTube or anything like that where it was just we broke it until it worked.
yeah. That's, so, kind of, you know, there were Usenet groups, there were the, internet
Yeah.
forums, which, I
Yeah,
owe
yeah.
most of my career in life to internet forums. But I
Yeah,
mean, you
I
could
would agree.
go search it out. It wasn't, how do I configure, SQL Server in YouTube? And, I pick exact versions that, are available, and somebody will basically do all the work for me on YouTube. And I just have to, watch them and type the commands into another machine. I mean, you had to really work for it a little bit. So I think that helped me out a lot more, is it forced you to think more, and it forced you to, go through garbage posts and, find the ones that were actually of value.
Right.
So it started, as I will talk about, as I started to transition to a PM, some of those skills of being able to, decide quickly if what you're reading was BS or not, kind of helps out in the long term.
I mean, that's true. Having a good kind of, I try to explain to people that if you're getting into technology, knowing the basics is so important. It's really, you can have a ton of deep technical book knowledge, but if you don't know how the parts interconnect, it's going to be very difficult. As a project manager, you're dealing with highly technical people, sometimes people with kind of big egos, and sometimes, how do you bridge that gap from someone you may not know the subject matter exactly, but you might just know enough to kind of at least talk the talk? Like, how do you get to that point?
I think just from going through more projects, the story kind of continues that, I was at the Patent and Trademark Office, and, going back to forums, a buddy of mine from one of my forums, he was moving down to the Houston area. He was up in the Northeast. He was a, senior executive at a, Fortune 50 company, probably Fortune 50. Talking to him about the things I was doing, he said, hey, well, he was a long time, kind of consultant that, went, executive. And he said, hey, I'm moving back down to the Houston area. I'm going to start my family. Um, what you're doing, sounds like basically what I've done my entire career. Do you want to come down to Texas? I'll take you under my wing. I'll make you a PM. If you listen, work hard, you'll do fine. I said, well, nothing's really tying me to the DC area. Let me come on down to Texas. So I moved down to Texas, and I was a project manager for a custom software development project, kind of an enterprise level. This was 2010, yeah. So it was all C sharp, which was all the hotness back then. Uh,
Right.
and I kind of jumped in. All right, well now I'm going to be a full on PM. So I'm not a coder. I've not really ever dealt with that to any extent. So one of the things that he mentored me in was, on every project that you're on, you better pick up a new technical skill, and you better do something to make you a better PM. So I said, well, right off the bat, I'm articulate. I can write. There were BAs on the project. Let me buddy up with the BAs. Let me start to understand, how do you write requirements? How do you engage with the business, and how do you engage with the technical staff? Let me sit down. So what I started to do also is, let me sit down with the developers. Let me see what they're working on. Sit in the daily stand-ups. See what they're delivering. Look at some of the preview builds that are going out. Play around with the build, see what breaks, see what works, and start to understand. Well, okay, I see these user controls you wrote, and I see how they work in the front end. Now I can understand a little bit of what goes into a user control. So when I start to talk to one of the requirement givers from the business, and they say they want this, that, or the other thing, I can say, well, all right, I don't think it does that. I mean, we could do it, unlimited time and money, you can get anything you want, but hey, I think I understand how these, how what we're building works. Would it make sense if we did something like this for you? Would that meet your requirement? Well, yeah, that'd be fine. So I got to the place where I was, writing, full detailed use cases and requirements. And in working directly, I figured another thing that would be useful to me is, let me work really well with the business to understand, what are you guys trying to do? So it's one thing to just, verbatim copy down their requirement and not understand what they're talking about, but I would take the time to understand, how does it need to work? What are they trying to do? What is the problem they're trying to solve? Because when I then give it to the developer, inevitably developers will have questions. Hey, this is a little unclear. What do you want to do here? And instead of just being someone that has to go back and forth and say, well, hold on, let me go ask the business. The
Right.
business said this, go back to the developer. Well, I have this question. Hold on, let me go back to the business. So let me try to understand the requirements to a subject matter expert level on the business side. Let me understand the technical solution as much as I can from the technical side, and kind of reduce the amount of time to have to go back and forth between the two. So I got pretty good at doing that. Another opportunity came up was, we were building UIs for this, and graphics around again. My mentor said, hey, you think you could write a UI? I said, I don't know. He goes, well, go ahead and do some tutorials. Grab, I think it was, I forget the tool at this point. It was an old Microsoft tool for XAML, which I don't think anyone uses for UIs anymore. But hey, do some tutorials, see if you can figure stuff out. I said, okay. Played around for a week or so, did some tutorials. He said, you feel like you're okay at it? I go, yeah. He goes, awesome. Get a copy of Visual Studio. Grab one of our dev branches. I'll show you how to pull it. Take a look at some of our UIs. Get comfortable with how the UIs work. I said, okay. Played around for a little bit. He goes, are you getting comfortable with it? I go, yeah, I think so. Okay, cool. Let's grab some of the low severity defects. And a low severity graphics defect is like wrong color box, wrong label,
Yeah.
doesn't pop up in a modal window when it was supposed to, things like that. And said, can you start closing out defects? I said, oh, why not? So I started closing out defects, and it worked well. He goes, okay, you think you could build a UI from scratch? I said, I don't know, maybe. He goes, okay, here's a screenshot, build it. I said, okay. I started hand coding, UIs, and they worked. And then he'd pull in, one of the dev leads and say, hey, here's a code base. Could you work with this? And I said, yeah, looks good. We can work with that. He goes, awesome. Derek, you're now building UIs as well. So I got familiar with
I
that.
feel like most of us who have had success in our career have very similar, like, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could figure it out. Like
Yeah,
that's kind of been that's the default answer. Like even when I took over the anti-phishing stuff and started working with that, they're like, hey, do you think you could build this program out? I'm like, I don't know. I'm sure I could figure it out. Like, just give me some time and get out of my way.
yeah,
Um, I don't know there's a lot of that anymore where we give people the opportunity to play and to learn, right? In business, it's all about kind of like that instant deliverable and that instant result. And I don't know if it's going away, but what have you seen kind of in your career? I feel like that's no longer really, we don't enable people as much as we used to kind of do stuff like that, like grabbing some random person saying, "Hey, you ever built a UI? Let's build a UI."
Yeah, I try. To your point, it makes sense as well. When I was just hardcore PMing everything, I don't really have a lot of time for that. Like you
Right.
always try to build some buffer into every project, every estimate. You put a little bit extra. You try to keep a little bit of budget hidden just in case because things go wrong. And to some extent, whenever possible, I'll try to kick tasks off to junior developers. Hey, try to work on this. Hey, do you think you could kind of grow into this area? I know you do you know mostly DV stuff. You want to learn a little bit of back end coding. Do you want to try to do some of that stuff? Yeah, I'm interested. Well, and I would treat it a lot like how I got treated. Do some tutorials. Get familiarized with what we're coding in the language. Let me know when you're ready. And I've done it on projects before, and they say, yeah, I feel okay about that. Awesome. Start working on some low severity defects. See if you can fix those. And when you can, we'll validate them. If they look good, do some more stuff. Code something really simple. I'll have a senior developer take a look at it. Employ that, but to the same extent, I want to deliver projects. And some of my earlier jobs, I would have 5 customers at the same time, 6 customers at the same time,
Oof,
and it's
yeah,
hard
that's
to
rough.
kind of balance that. And you want to close everything out as quickly as possible. So if Rob, if you're my back end developer guy, well, I want you killing it on the back end. I don't want to waste your time so you can fumble around on front end development. Just
Yeah.
kill it here and let me get my front end guy. And I would tell my team at the same time, like, hey, cross train yourself as much as you can. Take
Yeah.
some extra time. Grab some of the other guy's workload and you do it yourself, because at the same time, as a PM, you're also very risk averse. So if Rob's my back end guy, I always have to assume that you're going to get hit by a bus or win the lotto and you're gone tomorrow. And
Right.
now I don't have a back end guy.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act of trying to find lull in the project where hey, we can't really do a lot of parallel activity now, or we're a little bit ahead of the curve, and now I can kind of play it a little bit.
Well, I think just the fact that you're the type of leader who would think about that, right? And a lot of people don't realize a project manager, a good project manager, is a leader, right? Because they're not a boss. They're not telling you what to do. They're inspiring you to do it, and they're making sure that you have everything available to be successful. And their job is to remove any of those kind of roadblocks. But you're taking it one step further where you're also really feeding that engineer, right? You're feeding that developer and you're saying, "Hey, I know you like learning new stuff, and I'm sure you're tired of back end work. Like, why don't you, if you got a little bit of time, why don't you play here for a bit and see what you can kind of do?" I think that's a really big difference between like, bosses and leaders and really amazing PMs that I've worked with, all share that same quality. So you kind of were a project manager for a bit, then you pivoted it into like, building UIs and a bunch of other stuff as you're doing project management stuff. And then how did you get into data governance? And can you kind of explain to people what data governance is? Because this is an area of technology that it kind of branches across everything. It branches across cyber, it branches across all of your security and all of those things. Like, tell us a little bit about what data governance even is.
Yeah, so I mean, it's as you said, it goes across everything. It's really foundational. It's all of the controls around your data. It's data security. It's who can access, how is it being safeguarded. It's the overall quality of your data. Where do you have data quality rules? Where do you have observability? How are you building trust in your data sets? Um, how are you not allowing for kind of superfluous sources of data where you know some of the companies I've worked at, it grew by acquisition, and you end up with 14 sources of data. Some are duplicative. You look at kind of the data lineage landscape, and there's a ton of manual interventions where essentially anytime there's a manual intervention, just assume that every record that somebody has typed in is wrong. And it's how do you put controls?
That is so
you know,
factual.
how can you determine where errant data conditions are? How can you alert when they're coming up? How do you cleanse them? So data governance is kind of the full umbrella of kind of controls, quality, mastering. How are you structuring and organizing and making sure your data is available timely, clean, and that's essentially it. So how I kind of got that way. So same mentor. So we were at this enterprise custom software development project. He left there to go to a master data management company, and he said, "Hey, you want to come along?" I said, "Sure. Let me try something new." So that was kind of baptism by fire. That's the company where I had 5, 6 customers at the same time. Had I ever done master data management before? No. Had I done much with data before? No. So at the previous company, after I did the UI stuff and the BA stuff, and got more involved with PMing on a kind of day-to-day basis, I started to pick up. There was a kind of a reporting arm of the project, so I started working directly with the SQL guys, getting the requirements, making sure the reports were within spec and delivered in accordance with what the business was looking for. So that was my first kind of foray into data, which I found kind of fascinating. And then moving over to a master data management company, which their focus is more on kind of product information management. But again, that's now, hey, Derek, you are representing us, as the face of our company to multiple clients simultaneously, none of whom, necessarily know that what your true workload is, nor should they care. They should care that you're communicating timelines and you're able to deliver within the timelines you've communicated. So
Yeah.
that was a matter of, well, now I'd better come up to speed in what this whole thing was. So while working there, obviously managing the day-to-day, taking a lot of the skills that I built up in requirements gathering, the ability to get up to speed technically with what the developers and engineers are working on. And then in addition to that, it was starting to dive into the product. So we'd come to places where the customer was looking for things that weren't yet available in the product. And part of what we had was a full engineering team that was kind of offshore and fairly siloed from what the professional services team was doing. So if you wanted stuff done that wasn't on their roadmap, you better find a way to build hooks into the product and build them out for your customer. So I got comfortable with kind of pulling developers from multiple projects and building functionality for the app that was in line with what my customers need. And the way to do that, again, you talk about, as a PM, you don't have power. I can't tell a developer, hey, do this for me. I can, kind of suggest that, hey, you might want to do this. Here's some value. So, part of this was, I know I have a need for a particular piece of functionality that we don't have available yet. Let me start kind of polling around the different PMs and see if they need something similar. Let's figure out, all of their requirements. Let's find where the, kind of Venn diagram is of, well, instead of, me maybe getting one of my developers to build, this limited amount of functionality, well, I can probably get like 3 or 4 developers if I expand what I was building to, meet the use cases of 3 or 4 other guys. And maybe it's only 20% more work to do all of that, but I got 4 times the manpower now. So we can get through this pretty quickly. So I, kind of good at getting people onto my side and getting things. So that was the first
I think
bit
a
of
lot
data.
of your sales background, I think, also helped with that too, right? You've got the technical, which you've kind of gleaned from just tinkering and playing your whole life, and then the sales side is where you use those skills. I try to explain to people, like, even if your job doesn't directly translate into technology, you can use those skills later. Like, I mean, just the fact that your art degree, right, has come in handy to a point where they're like, hey, didn't you do art at some point? Why don't you
Yeah.
build a UI? Right? I really love to see, because that is where the new stuff comes. That's where the new stuff happens, and that's where you actually start creating and really innovating, when you're not afraid to fail and you're just like, yeah, I can figure this out.
Yeah.
So
It may not go
looking
about
at,
it the right way, but
yeah,
I
yeah.
can get it done.
Right. Well, yeah, I've always had coders look at my stuff. They're like, what are you doing? It's like, I mean, it works, but
Yeah.
man, it's ugly.
Well, similar. So when I was at the patent office, there was like a big event going on, and they said, "Hey, can you design posters for this?" I'm like, "Sure." How big do these posters need to be? And it's like, 24 by 36 or 36 by 48 or something like that. Now, you probably know enough, and anyone that's done digital art listening to this would say, "Okay, so you probably opened up Illustrator or something like that." I have
Yeah.
no concept of how to use Illustrator. Pretty good at Photoshop. I can create a 3 foot by 4 foot 300 DPI canvas,
Exactly.
and that is what I did. I had these, 500 meg TIFF files or whatever they were back in the mid 2000s. And sure enough, hey, here's a cool poster done exactly the wrong way. That I struggled to find a plotter and a computer that could actually run it and actually print this out, but we got through it. Did it wrong, but we got there.
Right. Well, I mean, I think looking at my career, it's just been a series of kind of follies and just figuring stuff out, right? Like, oh, well, that didn't work. I won't do that again.
Yeah.
And learning from those things. Looking at your career trajectory, like I don't think you ever really necessarily thought you would end up in technology. I've known you for a long time. Ironically, we met on those forums at a
Yeah.
meetup, which is and we've been friends for a very long time. I know when you were going to Full Sail, you were all in. Like you were gonna be designing graphic stuff forever, even though it wasn't something you were too excited about when you originally did it, which was really interesting to me. With kids now, like and kids who are getting out of college, I mean, what skills do you think they need in a modern job market that maybe you don't learn in school? What are some of those skills that will take them further that they may not learn?
It's cool stuff, really. So, I've been part of internship programs, and talk to kids, coming out of a, programming background or, DBA background or something like that. And, a lot of them haven't done the additional kind of practical work. They can probably, cite back to you, kind of the textbook answers to things. But, if it's SQL and you're like, hey, here's three tables, join them based upon the following conditions, filter out, certain things, and I want to see a result set with the following columns, grouped by whatever. And most of them will go, can I get an IDE to build this out? Like, no, just write it on the whiteboard. Go for it. Uh, not really. But then the kids that you'd say, well, even before asking something simple like that, hey, when you're not in class, what are you doing? Well, I built out, this test database, and I collect comic books or whatever, and I built a database to keep them all in, and when I send them off for grading, I can keep the scores and do all that stuff, and I can cross-reference it, all these different ways. And like, okay, sounds like you're doing stuff on your own, and then you say, well, okay, same thing, go do these joins and spit out these results set. Okay, cool. You want me to just start writing on the board? Yeah. And hey, don't worry too much about syntax. You don't have to be completely right, but let's just make sure your thought process is right. Like, oh, no, no problem. I got this. Don't worry about it. And sure enough, they'll go write, elegant SQL for you, with proper syntax. It gets exactly what you wanted. And, that's one of the pieces of, pick up projects that are, somewhat exciting to you. I was doing the animation thing. You'd learn enough in class to figure out, well, hey, here's how I can animate something, or here's how I can, put a skeleton in a body. But the fun that I had was, all right, my buddies are, trying from the gaming class are trying to build like a, a game engine. They want some assets. Well, hey, guys, can I help you out? What do you want? Yeah, well, we need some, some cars and tanks. Cool. How many polygons? What do they need to look like? Is there a certain art style? Do you have, some source imagery that you want to look like? And so yeah, something like this. Awesome. Give me a week. Let me build something out for you and see what it's like. So it's really getting that practical knowledge that I think has been the most helpful.
Yeah, and to stay curious, right?
Yeah.
And my biggest thing is don't look at your limitations as limitations. It's just stuff you haven't learned yet, right?
Yeah.
Like just because you don't know it now doesn't mean you can't, one of my mentors in the past, he always said, I reserve the right to be smarter tomorrow. So like even because he would give me advice on something and then like a month later I'd be like, you told me the exact opposite. He's like, oh yeah, I learned some things since then. This is a better approach. You
Yeah.
know, uh, I think that is missing because a lot of the people that I talk to don't have any of the practical knowledge to even be able to explain it. Like you said, they're very book smart. They can rattle off an answer, and hell, a lot of them are using Chat GPT and they become so reliant
That's
on getting
frightening to me,
answers. Yeah.
that the answer is given to you. That was going to be my other piece of advice: is don't ask for the answer to be given to you. Figure it out. Like, one of my mentors in the past too. had talked about somebody that came to him with a problem of, hey, I can't figure out how to do this. How do I do this? And he just went to a white, wrote like 10 things down. He goes,
Yeah.
did you do all those things? No. At least all of those things and prove all of those thought processes didn't work for you. Like, you got to do the thought process first. You have to exhaust every avenue to before you bring in the bigger guns to kind of walk you through this. My fear with AI in particular is you can cut all that out. I can type in, okay, pretend you're the greatest SQL developer. I'm going to ask a question, and you'll just spit out to me the proper answer. Well, I mean, it might not be the proper answer, but there's probably
Right.
a good
Yeah.
chance that you're getting something decent.
I mean, you would get enough. That's the thing. I
Yeah,
mean, and I've talked about it before. I've busted people on interviews who are using ChatGPT, and I'm not opposed to using AI to kind of help get an idea started, to challenge your own ideas. Where I get concerned is the same place you do, where people become incredibly reliant on the
yeah,
technology for their knowledge, right? It becomes a crutch more than
yeah.
anything else.
Well,
Like we,
in the
yeah,
interview, I need to understand, like, if I'm interviewing you, I don't want you touching any of that. I want to make sure that Rob can do the work.
yeah.
Now, when
Like,
you,
and that you, even if you don't know, just
yeah,
tell me you don't know.
oh, never be
It's,
afraid on an interview to say, I'm not sure how to do that. And
and
even
that's
offer up,
okay.
hey, I've got some ideas on what I might do. Do you want me to share them with you? Like,
Yeah,
don't be
I've
afraid
had
to say,
people
I
do
just
that.
don't know that.
Yeah. That I think is one of the bigger mistakes that a lot of people make is they will try to fake it. And you're like, bro, I do this for a living. I'm hiring for this role. Like
Yeah.
you're not gonna BS your way through this interview and like get one over on me. That's not gonna happen.
Yeah. I'll use ChatGPT or whatever as kind of a shortcut. Hey, I need to write up, a particular use case or document on a topic.
For
I
sure.
just don't, I can write it from scratch and it's going to be 5 pages, but I can just type in a few quick prompts and it's going to spit out something that maybe it's 70% of the way there. And I can
Right.
read through it and edit what's necessary and put it into the language and tone that I want it and have, the proper specifics. And instead of me spending 5 or 6 hours, I can knock it out in 45 minutes. And now I have time to focus on other tasks.
Yeah.
But
And that's where it should be
you need to
used.
know how to do that from scratch before you should be using an AI tool to do it for you.
The way I look at it is like when you're playing through a video game, right? Like I even have it on my wall here that cheat guides can be used after the game has been beaten, right? It's basically the same equivalent. ChatGPT is easy mode, and you have to earn that right to kind of take those
Maybe that's why we
shortcuts.
figured out technology because we come from like the NES generation.
Right.
Like,
Honestly, I was thinking about that
those
just as
games
we were
didn't help
talking.
you. And if you
No,
needed a tip, you had to call like a 900 number. I don't even know if there are
you
900
did.
numbers anymore,
It was.
but you had
Yeah,
to trick your
Nintendo.
parents into paying like, $5 for
Yeah,
someone to
yeah.
tell you, which dungeon in Zelda you needed to go to, for your next item.
100%. Like there we didn't have in and when they started coming out with cheat guides, like all of us who are like the old school gamers were like, you don't touch that damn thing until you
Oh no.
finish the game.
Yeah.
Because it was you had to kind of earn the right to be able to use the shortcuts. And even now, I still do that. Like even when it comes to when I'm learning a new technology or learning a new thing, I do it the hardest way possible first, and then once I do it the hardest way, then my goal is to how can I streamline this and make it as easy as humanly possible to do in the future, right? How can I?
Yeah.
And that's where AI think has a lot of great, promise. The problem is a lot of people are utilizing it as the source of truth, and it's wrong. And the more you interact with it, the dumber it gets.
Yeah, I mean, going
Uh,
back to data governance as well, it's only as smart as the model it's been trained on.
right.
Garbage in, garbage out. And you see,
Yeah.
I forget some of the ones, but when you start to see, some of these other, AI tools that are coming out that are trained on the language models from another AI tool. And it's like now we're talking about, recording a cassette off of a cassette off of a cassette. And it just starts to get
Yeah.
really gnarly really fast.
I mean, we saw what happened when we turned on, Grok and just removed all filters. It become instantly racist because it was taught by the internet. Um, it's one of those wild things where as we learn more about these large language models and things of that nature, we have to get smarter. But a lot of that intelligence comes from just a core base understanding of the product. And I think your career is a perfect kind of analog to that, where you've utilized all of your different skills that you've learned across your lifetime. And then you've also taken the things that have meant the most to you that your mentors have done, like giving you the opportunity to kind of learn new stuff and challenge yourself. If you had one piece of advice that you could kind of give to like a young kid who's trying to enter this job market, who wants to kind of stand out and maybe get into like a data governance role, what's that kind of quick piece of advice that you would give them?
Hmm. So getting into data governance in particular, again, it's kind of a wide umbrella. Where do you want to jump in from? I think you can go in on kind of the analyst side of it with kind of a strong, business analysis kind of background. Take some classes in SQL. You understand how data structures work. You understand how databases go. Learn some of the basics of what's in a data dictionary. Learn about what data profiling and things are, which I mean, that's one of the places I gravitate most to, which is probably why data governance is where I'm at now. But you can get some of those fundamentals and move in that way. Another way to go would be, go your kind of traditional, kind of data engineering path. Probably more lucrative, but learn Python, learn SQL.
Yeah,
Get familiar
Python.
with, get familiar with building data pipelines. You know,
I mean, it just comes down to, again, the basics, right?
yeah,
Like learn the basics and really understand them, and don't take the shortcuts, even though they may be there. Derek, thank you so much for coming to hang out. I thought this was a really cool area that a lot of people don't even really know about. So I truly appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been awesome to kind of watch your journey, being friends with you as long as I have, from where you've gone and then how you've been able to pivot that and just continue to crush it with your career. It's been awesome.
yeah, pleasure talking to you. And the career journey keeps going. We went from managing projects to managing direct teams of data engineers and data governance analysts and report writers, and building out platforms and entire kind of data governance programs at companies. So it's a fascinating and fun market. And for whatever reason, I kind of enjoy data, and more importantly, kind of the quality aspect of it probably.
Hell yeah. Thanks, man.